Hey everyone, welcome back to English for W. So in this week we're moving on to U, which in a lot of ways is kind of a solution to a lot of the kind of problems that we've been seeing in the relationships that we've read so far, primarily in the short stories, but also in Taipei, with what I called in another lecture video the fuckboy kind of dude. So these dudes that kind of analyzed through the lens of cold intimacy. They were kind of passionless, indecisive, didn't really know what they want. And in you, well, we have the cure for that. We have a guy who very much he really knows what he wants, and there isn't. It's kind of arguable if it's passion, but there he definitely has some very strong feelings for Beck. It's definitely not like a situation like Clam. So Joe in this story is kind of, yeah, I think he's a nice kind of opposition to some of the men that we've seen, the male characters that we've seen in the stories before. So obviously, then there are also problems with that. So I'm just going to talk in this presentation a little bit about the representation of love in you and how it isn't really a super kind of emotional or passionate love, but maybe a little bit of something else. And that something else does, I think, make us question what we understand love to be and what we want love to be in the world today. So I'll just get into my PowerPoint. So here we have Joe slaying all the dragons for Beck on the left here. And yeah, basically protecting her, saving her, or at least that's what he has in mind that he's doing. Okay, so I think the easiest thing to do to start with is the main character, or the main woman character's name, Guinevere. So Guinevere goes back to the tales of King Arthur. Guinevere was Arthur's wife, and she fell in love in some tales with the knight Lancelot, and it was a real kind of a paradigm for the relationship of courtly love. So it was an impossible relationship where Sir Lancelot did all these things for Guinevere, but obviously their relationship could never be consummated because Guinevere was married to King Arthur. So there are some references to courtly love in You, and they come from both Joe and Beck. So courtly love is still a metaphor or a way of going about a relationship that still has some relevance today. So Joe, very early on, he says, "You have standards, and you are Guinevere, a love story waiting for the one. And I bet you capitalize the one when you dream of him, of me." And Guinevere later, she says to Joe when they're at the bar, on their first kind of serious date, "You're a protector, my knight in shining armor." So there's still some kind of ways that this idea of courtly love still hangs on as depicted in this novel. And here is Slavoj Žižek, who wrote the optional article this week talking about courtly love more in depth. And he had a very kind of pessimistic view of courtly love, which is probably, I think, accurate because even when courtly love was going on in the medieval era, it seemed like this kind of elevation of women to a kind of higher status, as they would give men or their knights all these tasks. It was the woman that was in power in a little bit of a way, but historically during that time, women had very little power, and even the kind of idealized woman or fair lady, she only really had this power when she was kind of being wooed or when she was being pursued by a man. But as soon as she kind of gave in and was married, she would lose all that power. So it was kind of an elevation of women, but it was also an idealization of women. And Zizek has this critique of courtly love that I think applies to you and to Guinevere, or Beck as she's called. So the lady is never characterized for any of her real concrete virtues, for her wisdom, her prudence, or even her competence. So this is a Jacques Lacan quote that Zizek uses. So this obviously I think applies to you in that it's unclear to me what exactly Joe loves about Beck in terms of any of her kind of personality traits. Uh, there's glimmers of things that he kind of likes about her a little bit, but a lot of it is kind of driven, I think, by this idealization of her. He calls her pure at moments when he's really attracted to her, or kind of innocent, and he's also kind of very physically attracted to her. So yeah, so she, Guinevere Beck in the novel, she doesn't really have that much substance. And I've watched the TV show. She seems to have more personality or more substance in the TV show. In the book, because it is kind of more completely, entirely from Joe's perspective, it's really hard to get any kind of handle on her actual personality or any actual substance to her that she has beyond Joe's idealizations of her. She's kind of empty, and she reminds me a little bit of the Robert character in Cat Person. That we, as a reader, we're never able to really get a feel for this person, partially by the way that the story is constructed, but also because, like Robert, her personality is a little bit evasive. There's no kind of moments that really kind of stand out for me in figuring out what kind of person she really is. She seems to be different people for the different characters in the novel. So she's a different person with her friend group of Lynn and Channa. She's a different person for Peach. She's a different person for Joe. Once we get further into the novel, she's a different person for her therapist, for her father. She's very kind of multiple images, and yeah, when we get her through Joe's perspective, there's a very kind of strong element of idealization going on. Okay, and Zizek is, I think this is another important point. He points out that courtly love has nothing really to do with passion or even love. It's kind of, he describes it as a game, which again recalls when we were talking about Tinder a little bit. That it's just a game that these people play that kind of simulates love. And it's all about the woman kind of putting forward these obstacles to the man's pursuit of her, whether it's these impossible tasks, or in the novel, like going to IKEA to get her bed, all these quests that the knight has to go on first before he will be allowed to marry the woman. But yeah, it's not about kind of love. It's just about these series of steps or rules that have to be followed in order to win the game, pretty much. And Zizek, I think, makes another important point in this article, that he compares this courtly love game to the BDSM game, which is the kind of the power game that Joe and Beck kind of engage in. And Beck also engages in with Benji, where it's all about this kind of game. They turn sex into a game where it's all about kind of power and role playing. And it's not, well, not, there's not, well, it's, it's kind of I don't know how to say it. It's making sex into a little bit of a game. And in that game, like this kind of courtly love relationship, where the power is a little bit difficult to figure out, because of course the lady has the power to give the knight all these quests and stuff, but the knight is also kind of enjoying himself, probably doing these quests. It's kind of like the thing where the more obstacles or the more difficult something is, the more our desire for it typically increases. And obviously, even though the lady is in power in this courtly love relationship, that power can quickly disappear once she gives in to the knight. So there's just a scene on 244 and 245 when they're first, I think this is, when they're first having sex. And the power game, on page 244, there's kind of a very kind of insight into Joe's character. We got down here, my idea, I have the key, I am the boss. And I unlocked the cage and ordered you in there, and I locked it, and you smiled, and I told you to take your skirt off, and you obeyed. I am the boss, and I won't go through it, but he repeats I am the boss about 5 different times. So he is enjoying the sexual encounter through this kind of power game, where Beck kind of submits to him finally. After all these obstacles, after all these things that he's done, she finally gives in to him. But if you got into there, sorry if this is spoilers, but the sexual encounter doesn't end very well, and then that power relationship is immediately switched. I realized, this is Joe, I realized that you are the boss, not me, and you can please me on occasion if you want to. So there's always this kind of shifting power relationship. It's not really kind of the equality you would think of when you think of love. It's always someone trying to control the power relationship. And again, I think this kind of calls back to Cat Person, where Margot and Robert kind of fight a little bit over that power dynamic as well. Okay, so here is kind of talking about love as kind of a more general kind of social issue in contemporary times. So, and especially the way that love is portrayed in this novel, I think this Badiou quote, and Badiou is like one of the most prominent contemporary philosophers. He wrote this book called In Praise of Love. It's kind of a short book. If you want access to any of the materials that I talk about in lecture, please let me know. I have PDFs of them. I don't know if I should say that online, but yeah, if you want, if you're curious about any of the books I talk about, this one's a kind of a short book. So Badiou writes, it is generally thought that individuals only pursue their own self-interest. Love is an antidote to that. In love, the individual goes beyond himself, beyond the narcissistic. And I think this quote applies to you, and that's kind of the idea that Joe has about love, that love is something that will kind of allow Beck to escape this, her narcissism. And her narcissism is where she starts tweeting when they're on dates. She's kind of looking to get attention from multiple people and not just Joe. So Joe, I think, kind of would agree with Badiou that love is kind of one of our escapes from the internet, that if you're in a loving relationship with another person, you don't need the internet. You can just focus on them, which, yeah, I think you guys might know the reality TV show Love is Blind that was on Netflix. And basically, if you haven't watched it, it was about these two people that were in a pod, and they would kind of go on a date, a very blind date, in that they would never even see the other person. They would just have conversations. And in the pods, certain people develop these like very kind of intimate relationships just by talking, not even looking at each other. And at a certain point in the reality TV show, they get released from the pods. And one of the warnings that the hosts give to the people is that now you're entering back into the world of social media. So social media is like, they identify it as one of these things that can destroy a relationship. And it does, I think, in the reality TV show, it does end up kind of interfering with one of the couple's relationships, and then in that the woman in the relationship keeps looking at her phone, keeps looking at her phone or texting when her and the guy are on dates, and the guy kind of objects to this, that all her focus should be on him. So yeah, Badiou in this book does kind of argue against the internet, the way that it kind of interferes in love through this kind of the presence of an audience. But yeah, and Joe would kind of, I think, agree with that. But there's also, just as a kind of a counterpoint, because we've been kind of talking about this in our meetings, particularly Dom, who was talking about the social pressure to be in a couple, which is not something that you necessarily have to go along with. And I won't read out this quote because it's a bit of a long one from Laura Kepnes, kind of very similar name to Caroline Kepnes. And she wrote a book, again, a very recent book called Against Love. So it's a nice kind of dialogue piece with the Badiou book. And just in this little quote here, she has a little bit of a challenge to this idea of love as something that can save us from ourselves, particularly with the internet. So that's it for this lecture. I'll be releasing one more, or maybe two more, I'm not sure yet. So yeah, I'll see you guys in those next ones. Bye for now.